One of my favorite descriptions of the nuclear bomb comes from a survivor, Akiko Takakura. Just a few hundred feet from the center of the blast of Little Boy, Takakura's experience is likely one of the most valuable descriptions we'll ever get of what it's like to be so close to one of the most powerful weapons ever made. She tells the story of the nuclear bomb through her eyes. Death across the streets, lives of innocents taken in an instant, her world set on fire. For almost a century, popular media has been trying to recreate Akiko's experience. Most, understandably, fall short of this, unable to recreate the horror experienced by thousands that day. But regardless, the common consensus among books, movies, TV shows, and even games is that these warheads can only be considered a horrifying threat to innocent lives. At the same time, these weapons draw the eyes of creatives who see an opportunity to ignore their history and simply use them to help tell their stories. Year after year, the Call of Duty games release and attempt to tell a story about war and all of its intricacies. And each year, they fall short, creating plots that align themselves with less than mediocre action films and using atrocities, war crimes, and the deaths of millions to relay them without providing the slightest bit of criticism, even encouraging them sometimes. But among all of these, throughout their 20-year history, no aspect of war has gone more misunderstood in Call of Duty than the nuclear bomb. Each Call of Duty game exists in the context of nuclear war, every game telling a story coming during or after the US dropped the 2 bombs on Japan. From World War II to the modern day, war has been surrounded by the nuclear bomb, almost every conflict related to it in some way. But Call of Duty doesn't want you to know that, doing its best in each game to sidestep, ignore, or misuse them in whatever way helps them tell their empty war stories. What Call of Duty does to the nuke is a disservice to the people that have been affected by them and a gross misrepresentation of the destructive power they have on every level of our existence. Takakura's experience with the nuclear bomb should be the only way we talk about nuclear bombs, and Call of Duty fails time and time again to even recognize them as more than a plot point and a line of dialogue. From its staging ground to its role in the present, these games know the bombs exist. They know the destruction that they have and can cause. But they've never tried to convey that properly. Call of Duty has a nuclear bomb problem, and they really don't want to talk about it.
Short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
Though it may seem distant now, the original Call of Duty games were rooted in World War II, as most shooters in the early years of 3D video games were. It seemed like the obvious choice. Everybody knew what World War II was, everyone was making those games. Why would a company not hop on board and try to capitalize on this? What this resulted in was Call of Duty 1, 2, and 3, all of which taking place in this era and all of which being huge hits among fans of the genre. There was one caveat to this though. All of these games were set in the European theater, specifically Germany and France, which made sense. It was the most well-known portion of the war and made for the most marketable cinematic moments that could be advertised to the public. Call of Duty World at War would change this. Set in both the Pacific Theater and on the Eastern Front with the Soviets, the 5th entry into the franchise aimed to tell stories from the parts of the war that had gone completely ignored by video games up until this point. With half the war being placed in the Pacific, a major focus was put on the brutality and guerrilla tactics used in this portion of the war. Obviously, this is shown to be one-sided, with the Japanese soldiers being depicted far more negatively in a war that was fought horribly by both sides. There are 2 major atrocities that the United States committed in the Pacific Theater that are mentioned in this game, however, that get completely glossed over. A lie that is told to United States citizens since we are children is that the use of the nuclear bombs at the end of World War II was out of necessity, that there would be no way to fight the depleted Japanese forces without losing hundreds of thousands of American lives. This isn't why the bombs were used though. It was a show of power to not Japan, but the Soviet Union. And in a game that goes back and forth between the two powers that would immediately go into a Cold War after this conflict concludes, World at War had a real chance to say something about using the deaths of thousands as a show of force, or how no matter how brutal a war may be, the use of a weapon of such power shouldn't be viewed as anything other than a crime against mankind. Instead of this, the nuke is a footnote. Part of the ending cutscene that doesn't last longer than a few seconds. World at War loved showing violence and atrocity its entire runtime, but when it came time to address one of the most violent acts of the war, they shy away. Following this, the player hears a real speech from General Douglas MacArthur about how he hopes a better, more peaceful world will come out of the end of the war that, in the context of the game, is supposed to be ironic and in reference to the Cold War. Any discussion about the nuclear bomb flies under the radar, or at least is underdeveloped in this speech. This game is just a missed opportunity. The Pacific Theater runs deeper than just the nuclear bombs. I'm not trying to dispute that. In fact, Call of Duty shows this when they return to the Pacific Theater in their 2021 game Vanguard, covering the early stages of the conflict with the Battle of Midway. But with World at War not only being set in the time frame where the bombs were dropped, but also acknowledging them, it's impossible to say that this game is anything but a failure in regard of its representation of Ground Zero of the weapons that would change the world. The Japanese are obviously demonized in this game, as they are in most American teaching of the Second World War. By making them out to be the absolute villains, it makes the use of the nuclear bomb easier to justify, both in real life and in the game. At the same time, America's standing as the absolute good guys in the Pacific Theater is at serious risk if the use of the nuke is questioned. World at War doesn't just want to avoid challenging the use of the nuclear bomb, it wants to avoid challenging the very foundation of the American narrative about the war in the Pacific by adding gray to the conflict that was perceived to be black and white. The nuclear weapons are a defining point in World War II, and an understanding of the events of this conflict are incomplete without them. Even though some of its events are completely made up, World at War is a game that covers two regions of the war that aren't focused on as much as Western Europe is, and because of that, it's hard not to say that it swings and misses at a chance to create a game that contains a story that completes the whole picture of the conflict. Call of Duty would return to this era a couple times in the future, both of which being outside of the setting and time frame of the use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The previously mentioned Vanguard covers multiple time periods and locations, all of which miss this specific point in time. Their 2017 release, simply titled Call of Duty World War II, returned to the setting of the Western Front for the first time since 3. Interestingly enough, this game also showed that Call of Duty is willing to mention tough topics, but again fails to say anything or represent them in a meaningful way. Granted, the nuclear bombs dropped in World War II only make up a small portion of the conversation surrounding the weapons. It's simply the short catalyst to the events that would follow it. But it sets a precedent for how these games would go on to cover this topic, a precedent that puts conversations like this one on the shelf in favor of the nothingness the games afterward would continue to be filled with. And this turned blind eye to the nuclear bomb only becomes more obvious when the games are set in the following era, and Call of Duty still does their best not to mention them.
Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness.
World War II was an important time for the nuclear bomb, the beginning, middle, and end of the world's history of the use of nuclear weapons in warfare rests entirely in this period. The Cold War, however, was just as important, as it was the time of the highest nuclear tension the world had ever seen. You see, no one really knew what the nuke could do prior to its initial use, but now, with the bomb's power on full display, the prospect of nuclear war as a reality was, rightfully, terrifying. And there are plenty of events and instances of this fear to create a game around. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the arms race, the standoff at the Berlin Wall, the opportunities are almost endless, most of which aren't capitalized on, which really takes away any of Call of Duty's credibility, if they had any to begin with, to write a Cold War story. Now, the Cold War wasn't just about nuclear bombs, that's not the point I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is that every aspect of the Cold War, from the space race, every war, spheres of influence, the espionage, the people that were put into power, almost all of it was, in some way, related to the nuclear bomb. But in most of Call of Duty's Cold War games, this isn't the case. Nuclear bombs are either ignored or, again, a cliff note in the grand scheme of the story, usually playing second fiddle to some other factor. COD's first Cold War game is Black Ops, taking place from 1961 to 1968, a period of time when the world was the closest it had ever been to total nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, Cuba and the US-Soviet relations with the country play a major role in the beginning of this game, but not because of the crisis. Instead, the mission taking place in Cuba only serves as a plot device to get the protagonist Mason into a Russian gulag after attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro. I forget how stupid these games are. In place of nukes, Black Ops' main weapon of mass destruction is Nova 6, a chemical weapon in the possession of the Russians that is an immediate threat to the US population. While the lack of conversation on nuclear weapons is disappointing in this game, it's important to note that chemical weapons were also a threat during the Cold War, being an equal part of the arms race. It's almost commendable Black Ops brought this point up. Almost. Like with nukes, Call of Duty has absolutely nothing to say about chemical warfare. Nova 6 is shown a couple of times throughout the game, but nothing is said about chemical warfare other than, "It's bad, we should probably stop it." It's here that you begin to notice a running theme throughout the Call of Duty games. They love to use these weapons to drive the story forward and maybe even show the effects on a small scale. But when it comes to denouncing these weapons and making a definitive statement on their stance on the use of these weapons, the game turns away. Like with nukes in World at War, denouncing them would again bring to question the righteousness of the United States, and they would never do anything like this. They would. They did. A lot, actually. Oh god. By calling to question the validity of the use of these weapons, the hypocritical nature of these stories would become even more obvious, as the United States is not exempt from these crimes. Nukes are mentioned in Black Ops, however, but again, just as a passing conversation to increase tension. And it's here that you may begin to realize that the weapon that is threatening the United States really doesn't matter. It doesn't change the plot at all. Swap Nova 6 out for nuclear bombs and the story doesn't change because it's just a plot device and nothing else. And it doesn't get much better in Black Ops 2. But to be fair to that game, the Cold War portions take place in the late 1980s, a time where nuclear tensions did begin to die down. The same can't be said for Black Ops Cold War. Cold War takes place in the early 1980s, a time when nuclear tensions were the highest they had ever been since the 1960s. And though previous games would shy away from this game actually does the opposite. The main plot of this game is centered around Operation Greenlight, a mission to disable a collection of American tactical nukes hidden under European countries before the Soviets get a hold of their detonation codes and villainize the United States by destroying most of the Western world. While this is incredibly sensationalized and not realistic in the slightest, I'd be lying to say that this wasn't a fairly exciting development for these games. For the first time in this subseries, nuclear weapons are made a point of contention, similar to how they were at this time. And it's not confirmed, but it can be assumed that these bombs are based, albeit loosely, on green light teams that were trained to deploy nuclear weapons in less than ideal situations. On top of all of this game isn't exactly painting the United States in a positive light, something these games have never done. Operation Greenlight isn't done out of the goodness of the United States heart. It's to cover their own ass after making a rash decision based off earlier Cold War fears that have come back to haunt them. I don't like this game, at least not any more than any of the other games in this series. But those other stories are really scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to both of these topics. So I'm mostly just happy that nuclear weapons have a major role in the story that they absolutely should have, and that it isn't making the United States out to be the perfect hero for once. But this is still Call of Duty, and it's not going to abandon a formula that's made it millions and millions of dollars for years. It's one thing to mention nuclear proliferation, but it's another thing to actually criticize it. While Cold War uses nuclear weapons as a plot point, it doesn't really have much to say about nuclear bombs and the powers that use them. The United States is at fault for putting those bombs in place, but they still get to play the good guy in the end and save the world like they do in every other game, with big bombastic fights that make the characters look, admittedly, pretty cool. The canon ending of this game shows the US in the positive light these games usually do, and lets them play savior once again without facing any consequences for their near destruction of the world. It doesn't matter how many bombs got stuffed under Europe, the heroes still get their patriotic fireworks show at the end. Blame is diverted from the Soviet Union as well when it's revealed that it's a rogue group of Russian militants attempting to detonate the bombs, taking any blame off both superpowers who, in reality, would have been responsible for any nuclear mishap at this time. This isn't a completely impossible situation, but it completely absolves the Soviet Union of blame and partially absolves the United States, both depending on the ending you choose. It's not like the characters can exclaim how terrible this was and how it'll never happen again, because we know it does. But the least they could do is place a little bit of blame on the people who caused the deaths or potential deaths of millions, which they don't. The Cold War offers plenty of opportunities to write a plot that not only places rightful blame on the powers in possession of nukes, but can also offer the high-tension moments and action that Call of Duty is looking for. It's not like it has to be historically accurate. None of these games are. All it has to do to be a successful commentary is take a stance on nuclear weapons and nuclear powers. But even when presented with the destruction of an entire continent and millions of deaths, Call of Duty Cold War decides to use the bombs as a tool rather than looking at them as the killing machines they really are. It's hard to write a story about a time in the past because that story is already finished. Period pieces have to rely on the structure of their time in order to exist without rewriting a significant portion of history. Call of Duty's Cold War era games show this. They rely heavily on the espionage and military activity going on in the background to tell their stories rather than real-world events. Even with this fact in mind, they still miss out on multiple chances to put nuclear weapons in the spotlight, and even when they do, they still struggle to provide any substantial thoughts about their existence.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Similar to the Cold War, making a game in the modern era is interesting in the sense that you can't tell the story of modern warfare without mentioning the nuke. And while the Cold War was heavily influenced by nuclear weapons and World War II served as the staging ground for the nuclear arms race that would come for the next century, modern warfare exists in the form that it does only because of the nuclear bomb. Beginning in the Cold War, superpowers would initiate proxy wars, backing the governments of small countries that aligned with their ideology as a way to combat the spread of an opposing ideology and gain influence over less powerful nations. Though this type of combat helped curb direct nuclear conflict between the United States and Soviet Union, It left developing nations in disrepair, and modern wars usually involve the consequences of such events. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is the first game in the series to explore these ideas and, at the time, was considered to be a revolutionary game. In a landscape filled with historical and futuristic shooters, COD 4 grounded itself in the present and presented topics not typically covered in video games up until this point. And with that came some controversial subject matter. The obvious example is the AC-130 mission Death from Above, where the player takes the role of a gunner in the aforementioned aircraft, indiscriminately taking out enemy soldiers with a spotter over the radio cheering you on. And it's more than just that. For all of COD 4's flaws, it does stay true to its name. The game contains terrorism, torture, rogue states, the state of turmoil the Middle East had sunk into thanks to colonization, all real aspects of modern war that are, as always, loosely based on real-world events and potential happenings, including the use of the nuclear bomb. In the mission Shock and Awe, the player plays as a US soldier fighting their way through a crumbled city that is believed to be the location of a puppet dictator of a Russian extremist group installed in the area. As the troops traverse the city, it's revealed through comms that it's believed that the dictator is in possession of a Russian nuclear weapon. These beliefs are confirmed when, as the US troops attempt to reach a safe distance from the city, the bomb is detonated. If you want, you can look at this as a commentary of the dangers of rogue states and how unstable governments with the backing and weaponry of superpowers can be deadlier than the superpowers themselves. But, like in Cold War, this deflects responsibility away from world superpowers. Rogue states have threatened to use weapons of mass destruction in the past, that is an undeniable fact. But never, in the history of the world, has a rogue state used a nuclear bomb against enemy troops such as this. The same cannot be said about the United States and Russia, who have both used nuclear bombs in combat and have threatened their use far more than any of these states have. It serves as a way to pass off the blame to anyone other than the superpower. By using these rogue states as scapegoats, modern warfare is completely ignoring the biggest threat to the world, superpowers such as the United States or Russia using these bombs. As a source of political commentary, Modern Warfare falls flat because, like every other Call of Duty, it fails to recognize the biggest nuclear threat in the game, the country you play as. But, for all of its shortcomings, it tries its best to make up for it, purely on spectacle. In all the previous iterations of the series, the nuke is only mentioned in passing. While it's a threat looming over the world, its full destruction is never put on display. The player is told the weight and power these weapons hold without truly showing why they should be terrified of them. You've never seen a nuclear bomb. Neither have I, at least not in person. And I hope that I never do. Despite this, I've always been fascinated with the bombs and their scale. I and millions of others have watched countless videos of nuclear test footage and looked at graphics examining the scale of these explosions. But even with this knowledge and experience, you and I will hopefully never know what it's like to stand at the base of a mushroom cloud. In Call of Duty 4, Infinity Ward creates this experience. At the end of Shock and Awe, you witness the bomb go off and see the city enveloped in smoke and flames. Then, the following mission, Aftermath, plops you in the middle of the blast radius. The damage is more than tragic, it's apocalyptic. The buildings that once surrounded the player, funneling them into lanes, showing them where they're supposed to go, crumble around you. The NPC soldiers you were fighting with crumple to the ground. Even though you don't know these characterless characters, it's hard not to feel sympathy for them as they die, and what you can imagine is one of the most horrible deaths a person can have. The world is on fire around you, both literally and figuratively. And when you think that it can't become any more mortifying, you look up. Megalophobia is the fear of big things, buildings, statues, monuments, etc. And I've never had this fear, but when I look up at this tower of smoke, my heart begins to beat faster. Maybe it's the fact that it caused this destruction that surrounds the player character. Maybe it's the knowledge that a force like this exists in real life in the hands of some of the least trustworthy people to ever exist. Or maybe it's the way the ash funnels up into the glowing red head of the cloud and how the sky opens up around it. It's a biblical level of power standing in front of you. If hell exists, it can't be much worse than this image created in this shitty video game from 2007. The rest of Modern Warfare suffers from the same problems the rest of these games do. Boring gameplay with a boring plot that has nothing interesting to say about its subject matter. This moment though, this lone moment, gives the game enough of a push to get it to the end. When nuclear missiles are launched later in the game, it actually has weight, a reason for the player to be concerned about finishing the game that all these other games are missing. It's enough to make this game even a little bit worthwhile. Following the success of the original Modern Warfare, a follow-up would be released 2 years later. Modern Warfare 2 exists in the exact same context and time as the original, and even includes some interesting ideas. The game is mainly about a full-scale invasion of the United States and the corruption within the institutions that run the world order. It's a plot that, like all the others, has the potential to offer some intriguing commentary about modern warfare. Instead, Captain Price nukes Washington, D.C. And to be clear, no one really knows why. It's a moment that completely baffles most people that have played this game and tried to analyze this story in any way. One of my favorite quotes from people trying to decipher why Price would do this comes from the Call of Duty fandom wiki, where it says, "It is unclear what the original mission of the team was in contingency, as they are all surprised when Price launches the nuclear missile from the Russian submarine, even though it was clearly the intent to secure the submarine or at least the submarine base. Their mission may have been to destroy the submarine and deny a Russian nuclear asset, one which can be used against the US. However, the reason why Price did not tell his team that he was going to create an EMP is not mentioned in the game, and strange." They continue, saying, "It is also not clear what the purpose for the EMP was. It is credited above with saving the Americans' lives by knocking out the Russian helicopters and gun sites, but it's not clear whether Price was intending this or just making it obvious that the war could escalate into nuclear conflagration if not ended now." Like the quote says, the nuke serves as an EMP to halt the Russian attack on Washington, which is an actual effect that nuclear weapons have, but it doesn't change the fact that this is the most ridiculous, drastic, and nonsensical measure to take. While I don't like the reason the nuke is included in the story of Call of Duty 4, that game gave the weapon purpose. This completely sidesteps that. They went from presenting the nuke in a way that was incredibly brutal and, for lack of a better word, scary, to showing the nuclear weapon as a tool that has zero consequences and ramifications that can be used simply as a way to keep the plot moving. Modern Warfare 2 is also the first Call of Duty game to introduce the nuke as a kill streak in its multiplayer mode. It's not worth reading into too heavily, as the multiplayer is simply an arcade shooter that lacks any meaning, but it's interesting that the game that uses the nuke like this in its campaign decides to trivialize it in every mode that it has. The final entry into this trilogy, Modern Warfare 3, uses the nuclear weapon in a similar way that Call of Duty Black Ops does. It's a looming threat, but not one that ever feels like it has real stakes to it. You could try to make the argument that the game is leaning on the first game's depiction of the bomb to stir up concern and fear for the player, which is giving the game a lot of credit. The game diverts focus away from the bombs so much that they just begin to feel forgotten. Like Black Ops, the story doesn't change much if you replace nuclear weapon with ground invasion or chemical warfare. The threat just never feels real. The Modern Warfare trilogy exists in a weird space. While all these games' depictions of modern war are lackluster in different ways, one constant among these three is their strange relationship with nuclear weapons. A relationship that spans beyond this series specifically. Starting with the original's horribly perfect depiction of the nuke visually and its strained relationship with the reality of the nuclear bomb, it seems like the series wants to explore these weapons. After this entry though, they fall right back into the trap the rest of these games do, using the bombs as a tool and not making so much as a peep of criticism toward them. If you, like me, wanted commentary from this franchise on nuclear war, these games were probably the best chance we were going to get. The games taking place in the past had potential as well, but those times are already gone, and they had chances in different ways than these games did. Call of Duty had the opportunity to be more than an action game, more than just military propaganda. It could have been a warning about the toll these weapons can take in the real world. Instead, all we get is a giant set piece. Takakura's description of the blast in Hiroshima should be the gold standard of nuclear representation, a reminder of the unbelievable tragedy and death these weapons have and can cause. Call of Duty falls below this. Their first showcase showed potential and the ability to understand what these bombs can do. But everything afterward loses this. Maybe it's because the power of these bombs are so great that they're scared to present these events as plausible branches of our own timeline. It's not a great way to draw an audience. Maybe it's because they want to keep the image of war in their heads and the heads of their players as romantic and lighthearted as possible. And to do that, they choose to ignore it, only begrudgingly throwing in a line of dialogue when it is needed for the plot. The only reason the nuke exists in Call of Duty is out of necessity. These games need it. They need a way to jumpstart their story that Total Annihilation gives. They need to mention it because it'd be strange if the nuke wasn't brought up at the end of World War II, or the heart of the Cold War, or the modern landscape of combat. They need to show even an inkling of competence in terms of writing a story about conflict in the world we live in to sell games to people like me that hope year after year that this game is going to be the one that actually says something about the subject matter. Anything past that is unnecessary in this franchise's mind, because it's a lot easier to ignore, abuse, misrepresent, even tease the most dangerous weapon ever created, than to actually talk about it.